Hi, I'm Victoria Stevens, and welcome to this podcast, Stock Exchanges. In my day job working as a fund manager at Lion Trust, investing on behalf of our clients in UK stock market listed companies, I'm fortunate enough to cross paths with some of Britain's most inspiring entrepreneurs. It's a huge privilege to sit across the table from the people who have put their heart and soul into growing and running companies. And in this series, I want to share that privilege with you, our listeners. Today's guest is Andy Thomis, the Chief Executive of Cohort, a defence technology group listed on London's alternative investment market. Andy started his defence career at the UK MOD, before subsequently moving into a strategy role at the armoured vehicle manufacturer Alvis plc in the late 1990s. And it was there that Andy first worked with Cohort co-founder Nick Prest, then the chairman and chief executive of Alvis. Fast forward a few years to 2004, and Alvis was acquired by UK defence giant BAE Systems. And it was that move that left Andy and Nick free to work on setting up Cohort alongside co-founder Stanley Carter. The aim was to build a group of defence-focused advanced technology businesses, benefiting from the agility and responsiveness of smaller subsidiary companies, while enjoying the stability and scale of a broader group umbrella. Today, the Cohort Group comprises 7 businesses, catering to defence customers at home in the UK and abroad. And its array of products and services range from counter-drone protection systems and naval sonar sensors, through to conducting an annual training simulation of a large-scale incident and military response by the UK Joint Forces. It's a particularly relevant juncture to welcome Andy onto the podcast, with the geopolitical backdrop increasingly turbulent and defence budgets of countries around the world being ramped up in response. Andy, thank you so much for agreeing to join me today.
My pleasure.
So I think we'll start where I always do, which is going right the way back to the beginning of your career and understanding a little bit about how you came to get into the industry of defence. So did you always know you wanted to work in a defence company? You know, what led you to that initial MOD role?
Well, back in the 1980s, I was very interested in technology. I was inspired by such wonderful inventions as the Sinclair ZX81 computer, amongst other things. I decided that was the career for me. So I did a degree in electrical and electronic engineering. And at that time, it was a very tense time geopolitically. The Berlin Wall was still standing. The inner German border was very tense. And a lot of technology that was finding its way into consumer society was first developed for defense purposes, rather the other way around than it is today. So, for example, mobile phones, the new kind of digital cameras, all of these things were actually developed originally for defence purposes and then found their way into the civil world. And it seemed to me that defence was a very interesting place to go technologically. And as I graduated, the Ministry of Defence had just introduced a new fast stream scheme for technologists, promising accelerated promotion and very interesting jobs. And taking into account the really interesting technology that was coming out of the Ministry of Defence's research establishments at the time, that was very appealing to me, and that's what brought me into it in the first place.
That's so interesting, and we'll definitely get back into how technology has advanced in your years in the career later on in the podcast. So you've covered a little bit about what it was like to get into, or what drove you into the MOD. But obviously, you know, there's probably quite a big difference between working in that public sector role and working in the private sector where you had done after you left. So tell us a little bit about the different challenges and opportunities that you saw comparing the two.
Well, my time in the Ministry of Defence was immensely valuable to me and very stimulating in many ways. At first, I was working on some really very interesting technology in the defence world, but I moved on into roles in project management and ultimately in the private office of the Defence Procurement Minister. So I learned a lot about technology. I learned a lot about the way that defence works and the way that technology is used. I learned a lot about UK defence policy thinking. And I also learned that I don't like working in large bureaucracies. And that's why it was in the mid-1990s I decided to leave and moved actually initially into capital management consultancy, which was quite an education coming from the public sector into a professional services organisation with the pace and the imperatives that involves before moving on to Alvis, as you mentioned in your introduction, Victoria.
Yeah, absolutely. And in Alvis, that was the first time where, if you like, the cohort group of individuals who've been behind the success of the business ever since first came together. I think I'm right in saying that Simon, your finance director now, also worked in a role at Alvis. So, can you tell us a bit about how you came to start working together, what the experience of that was like, but also the different challenges and benefits you see to working with that same group of individuals for a long period of time?
Yes, and that's right. I was recruited by Nick Prest and joined Alvis in early 1997, roughly at the same time as Simon Walther, who came in as financial controller at that point. And for me, it was a great experience. The ethos of the Alvis business was very much around building a group of businesses, each of which had some real strengths and run on a pretty independent basis as well. So we had a small headquarters team. And we looked to bring in the best management for each of those businesses and make sure that they were well motivated. And in turn, they were very successful in what was at times a difficult market, but in times a very good market as well. And over the period that we were there, we succeeded in bringing together the large majority of the UK's armoured vehicle businesses, as well as overseas businesses in Sweden and South Africa as well, before the business was eventually acquired by BAE Systems in, I think it was 2004. And over that time, we got to know each other very well. We realised that we had similar instincts in business terms, I think. And it was, I think it's fair to say, a powerful combination, especially led by Nick, who was a great chairman and chief executive. And so after the BAE Systems acquisition, I was certainly thinking about what my next step would be in terms of career, and Nick approached me and said, would I be interested in working with him on something new, perhaps founding a new business? And I was very keen to take up that challenge, and that's what resulted in us eventually getting together with Stanley, who brought his own fantastic experiences, as well as the business SCS, which became the seed from which Cohort grew.
Yeah, so Stanley's business SCS was acquired into the group effectively at the time it was founded and floated all at the same time, wasn't it? So what was the vision when you set out? I kind of skimmed it in my introduction, but it'd be great to hear in your own words, Andy, what you saw as being the advantage of creating this group where the individual businesses can really thrive under that group umbrella.
Yeah, well, I have to say that the vision has evolved, if visions can evolve over time. But at that time, it was just when Kinetic, which had previously been the government's defence research laboratories, had been privatised and was just coming to the market in its IPO managed by Carlyle. And so we saw that as a natural opportunity for offering competitive services to Kinetic, which was no longer an in-house provider for government. So we saw providing defence technology-based advice and services into the UK MOD as being an area ripe for new competition. And we had the concept of putting together a multi-business group of small to medium-sized agile businesses providing those kind of services, because we felt that that would be a good way of competing with a large, complex organisation like Kinetic, which just wouldn't be able to move as fast. Now, over time, that vision evolved for a number of reasons. One was essentially the businesses that were available for us to acquire to build the group, and there weren't that many that were operating in the pure advisory services area. Another was the arrival of austerity in 2010, which resulted in the MOD cutting off a lot of its external advisory services. And a third was our realization that actually providing technology and products was likely to be much more scalable than simply providing services, and also offered a way into a much wider market for defence exports, as well as just domestic sales as well. So over time, that vision matured into what it is now. But throughout that, a common theme was the idea that small to medium-sized businesses, given a good degree of operational autonomy and given the support and backing of a strong headquarters in terms of financial support and also mentoring mentoring and understanding and providing additional support that was needed was a very good model for operating in this marketplace.
And how much power do you then devolve down to the management teams of the individual businesses? Has that evolved over the time that you've been founded, you've been established?
Yes, gradually. We've got a fairly well-honed model of delegations in terms of financial authority, in terms of decision-making authority, that essentially means that the management teams of the individual businesses are responsible for a lot of the day-to-day management. And beyond that, we have an ethos where, unless there's a very good reason to, we don't second-guess management decisions of our teams. Instead, we aim to bring in and appoint the best people that we can and give them the support that they need. And that's proved successful for us by and large.
Yeah, absolutely. And the wider group umbrella, of course, helps you to mitigate those inevitably quite lumpy contracts that then come out of the industry, don't they? Not only do they give you an advantage when it comes to procurement because you're a group with greater scale, but they also help to smooth out those large orders. Defence is fantastic in a sense because you get that very long-term visibility. Often the contracts are, multi-year, even stretching out to over a decade in length. But of course, when they come in, can be quite difficult ultimately to predict.
Yeah, that's certainly right. The metaphor that's always been used is of a multi-cylinder engine, and perhaps not all the cylinders are firing at once. Now we've recently grown to 7 businesses. That's stretching the metaphor a little, as I've not come across a 7-cylinder engine yet. But I mean, you can get the idea. I think defence is very much like that. We do get large, long-term contracts. Certainly over recent years, there's been quite a number of those. But they also have a certain rhythm to them with a strong start to expenditure as products are developed and go into production, and then perhaps a slower tail over a period of time. And so having multiple ones of those in different areas does help to smooth out the overall running of the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mentioned in my introduction, you've referenced it a couple of times, you've now got 7 businesses under the group banner, and it would take us the remainder of the time that we have today to describe in detail what each of those businesses does and their particular competitive differentiation. But I think it would be really helpful for listeners who are unfamiliar with the group to just bring it to life a little bit by giving a few examples. I skimmed it again in my introduction, but give a few examples, Andy, if you don't mind, of the types of products that the group or services that the group is providing, and where those individual businesses and their ability to be agile and flexible and innovative can really bring that element of competitive differentiation.
Yes, of course. One good example would be something called the crate array. Now, that's crate with a K, so a sea snake rather than a wooden box. That does look rather like a sea snake. It's a long tube about hosepipe diameter, about 50 metres long, which is pulled behind a submarine or a surface ship and acts as a very sensitive sensor to detect submarines or unmanned underwater vessels under the surface. Now, it's not an entirely new idea. These things have been around for quite a long time, but on much, much larger scale, often weighing many tons and only suitable to be used on a very large vessel. These can be pulled by an unmanned vessel themselves, either on the surface or underwater, or by a very small manned naval vessel. And that brings a new, very capable anti-submarine capability to navies that operate only smaller vessels, or to be used with quite significant numbers, because these are relatively inexpensive, of unmanned vessels, providing potentially area defence against the submarine threat, and a way of detecting threats against underwater infrastructure, which is becoming increasingly important at the moment. So that's a good example of the kind of innovation that we're involved in. Another would be our satellite communications terminals for use on naval ships. And now these are produced by the business that we acquired recently, EM Solutions, based in Brisbane in Australia. And compared to the competition, they're much, much more able to stay locked onto a satellite. Of course, satellites don't move that much, but ships certainly do on rough seas. And maintaining that high bandwidth, reliable, digital, secure communication over long distances is something that we can provide that others can't.
There's fantastic examples, Andy. Thank you. I want to just pick up very quickly there on the idea of this ownership of intellectual property and the advantage that brings to the individual businesses. We, in our investment process, when we're investing day to day in companies, IP, the ownership of IP, is something that we prize very highly within that investment process. But I think that when we look at different industries, the approach to protecting IP can be very, very different. So would you agree that yours is a business where the legal protection of intellectual property is actually quite a challenge because of the potential for it to then be stolen by bad actors? And is it something which you would see as being much more of a kind of know-how type argument?
Very much so, very much so. I mean, we do have a lot of intellectual property as a group. It's that innovation and those new ideas and solutions that are the lifeblood of our success and why we are successful with so many customers, both domestically and overseas. But protecting that intellectual property is primarily a matter of secrecy rather than patents or legal protections. The problem, of course, with patents being that it makes public the nature of the invention. If, for example, you're out at sea on a ship and you encounter a hostile ship brandishing some similar technology to your own, phoning a patent lawyer is not going to be your best method of protection. So absolutely, you're quite right.
Interesting, thank you. And I'll take us in a slightly different direction now, if that's okay. I wanted to explore that initial decision to list the business full stop and list the business on the AIM market in particular. I suppose the first question there would be quite an open question. Why did you feel as a team that having a public listing for the business was desirable?
Well, we had in mind, certainly, a buy and build strategy to create the kind of multi-business group that I've described. And to do that, we clearly needed a source of finance. And we were very lucky to have Nick as the prospective chairman then of the group, who came with a very strong record of delivery in listed companies and very strong contacts, not just in the defence world, but also in the City of London. So we did have options, and we looked both at the possibility of a listing on AIM and potentially looking at private equity backing as well. But what we wanted to do was to create something meaningful and lasting, which we saw was potentially taking really quite a long time. And so when we looked at the options, that of a public listing with investors who had a similar long-term outlook looked to us like the best approach. People talk about the City of London having a very short-term outlook, but here we are almost 20 years later with quite a few of the same investors who came in at that IPO still very much on our books. And so it has worked out well for us on that front. The benefits of AIM, as we saw it, and as I think I see it now, were having that long-term relationship with investors, but also the reputational benefits that having a listing bring in terms of an expectation of professionalism, of good financial backing, of sound management that are really very important to customers, particularly with a new business, with a hitherto unknown name like Cohort. The price of that, of course, that one has to pay is the regulation, the transparency, and so on that public markets require. And I think, on balance, over the period of time, that's been a price well worth paying. Although I have to say, at the time of the IPO, we did feel at times like a sort of goldfish in a piranha pool of lawyers and accountants. But overall, I'd say it's worked out well for us. And I'm not sure it would have worked out as well with a private equity backing.
It's really interesting. And did you ever, I suppose it sort of harks back to what we were just talking about in terms of the challenge of making your intellectual property public. But do you ever find that there's an inherent challenge in the degree of transparency that's required from a publicly quoted business, given the industry that you're in?
Yes, there is. We are under strict requirements of confidentiality from our customers in many cases. But it's never been impossible to square that with the requirements of transparency on markets, which are generally focused on financial transparency. And that's something that we can do, even if we can't say very precisely what it is we're actually doing for our customers.
Absolutely. And one challenge which I'm sure you've experienced in the past, but perhaps has shifted quite materially over the last couple of years, is this whole topic of so-called ESG, environmental social governance factors to consider for investors. And I think it's very interesting personally how the perception of what constitutes good from an ESG perspective has been fundamentally reshaped by, well, initially Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. We were never investors that necessarily believe one industry good, one industry bad. There are definitely, you need to delve a lot further into the matters at hand than that. But have you experienced a fundamental shift in the perception of your business as a company operating in the defence sector as a result of that catalysing moment?
Well, certainly we've seen a welcome and strong voice from government and elsewhere about the desirability of having a strong defence industry. From my personal perspective, I think the sea change that we've seen in the market and the demand tailwinds has arisen more directly from the otherwise very unwelcome changes in the geopolitical situation than they have from a change in perspectives on ESG. I think there definitely has been a change in perspective on ESG and on DEI as well. I think that some of the initial research by McKinsey that suggested, for example, that diversity was a cause of good business success, has been called strongly into question. And one doesn't have to look too far offshore to see certain other influences that are changing perspectives on these matters. What I would say is that there have been, and there still are, banks which decline to provide services to UK defence businesses, and at the same time are quite happy to provide services to overseas governments which themselves are quite cruel and repressive. And if you wanted to find an example of an unethical business, you might perhaps focus on that rather than on defence businesses. But for the record, I do think it is possible to run a business that is generating defence equipment and technology in an ethical way and with integrity. And I believe that is a highly desirable thing to do. And I believe it's very important to be able to provide defence technology and equipment that protects the UK and its allies.
And that is supported by the government's own industrial strategy. I mean, defence, one of the areas that's been identified as a key kind of pillar for the growth agenda looking forward.
Indeed, which is gratifying to see. And we have a strategic defence review, which I hope will see the light of day in the coming months. And it will be very interesting to see the proposals that are put forward there. But I think there's a recognition, and there was by the last government too, that defence industry is an integral part of UK defence capability.
So Andy, if we move on to the broader backdrop, I know our listeners, as I am, will be inevitably unsettled by what's going on in the geopolitical backdrop. And I think it's really hard not to feel like we're all living a bit at the precipice in terms of that geopolitical instability in multiple areas of the world. You've obviously got Russia, Ukraine, but Chinese aggression has been a theme for many years. You've got the conflict in the Middle East. It's now being, of course, compounded by a potential schism in the near century-old Western defence alliance between the US and Europe. In your opinion, you've been working in this industry for almost 4 decades now. Have we ever experienced such an elevated and complex threat before?
Since the Second World War, we've seen many moments of high tension. The Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. We've seen the Vietnam War, the Korean War. We've seen the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've seen the rather scary Able Archer incident in 1983. But we are indeed facing, I think, an unusually tense moment. Perhaps the best comparator to it is the period around the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the early 1980s, which ultimately led to the fall of the USSR and a period of, well, relative at least, tranquility. I'm afraid I'm not quite so optimistic that history is going to repeat itself this time. And yes, we are facing a moment of great instability.
And in terms of what that's meant for your industry, I mean, we've clearly already seen a much greater commitment on behalf of multiple countries around the world, Europe most notably probably, to a greater level of defence spending. Do you see that, and does your board see that as a sustainable step change in the mentality around protecting our own nations?
Well, I think my perspective on this is that yes, we're seeing a step change. We're seeing a real acceleration in defence expenditure. Part of that is focused on the live conflict in Ukraine, but part of that is a longer-term response to what are clearly sea changes in the geopolitical situation. It's hard to predict the future, but just looking at Ukraine, even if the current efforts to bring about a ceasefire are successful, and I sincerely hope they are, what we're going to see really over the long term is a long contested border with a build-up of forces on either side. And that on its own is likely to result in a long-term trend for greater defence spending in Europe. We see a similar pattern in Asia, where Chinese investment in its own armed forces, particularly its navy, is driving a response from neighbouring countries and even quite distant countries in Asia Pacific. So I do see this as a long-term trend, yes.
Interesting. And how good do you feel that we as the UK are, and indeed the whole of the European continent, at nurturing the kind of early stage investment, innovation and scaling up businesses that's going to be required in order to fulfill our pledge of safety, if you like, in that unstable geopolitical environment?
Well, historically, the UK has been fantastic at developing new, innovative and really effective defence technologies, generally just too late to have any kind of deterrent effect. Now, can we bring about a situation where we're looking at developing those technologies in advance of having to use them in conflict, ideally to deter such a conflict? Well, that's a question I'm sure the Strategic Defence Review is looking hard at. Historically, that's been something that's very difficult to achieve. The seed for it all, of course, is government funding, or at least the promise of government funding, because that is what will unlock the private funding through debt and equity. But it's historically been a very difficult objective to achieve for all sorts of complicated bureaucratic reasons and for reasons of conflicts of objectives across government. Now, perhaps the new Strategic Defence Review will find a way of cutting across that. I certainly hope so. I think it would be a very valuable thing if it could.
And in a sense, I suppose that very instability, that very uncertainty in the backdrop potentially makes that a lot more politically palatable to be increasing budget for defence funding.
Yeah, I think there is a much greater realisation in society, certainly in the UK, where it always has been quite strong, but also beyond Europe and in places where perhaps that hasn't been the case, that having strong defences means a lot more than having some impressive uniforms and vehicles to run in front of the presidential residence or the royal palace on important days. Even when the military is not being used, the fact of its capability provides very strong deterrence. It is weakness that invites conflict, not strength. In today's world, strength is important, and it's something that we need to build if we want to deter future conflicts.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And in terms of the role of technology, I mean, we've talked about your role at the head of a group of innovative defence technology businesses. But in terms of how the advancements in technology over your career have helped to reshape the industry and how they might play directly into that capability, that strength that you talked about before. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that technological backdrop has evolved and what you see as being the various opportunities and threats coming from the advances in technology as we look forward?
That's a very big question. As I mentioned early on in the podcast, we've seen an evolution from technology being developed in the defence world and some of that leaking out into the civil world to exactly the opposite situation, where the driver of technology is the huge investments that are going into artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, social media and the internet, and some of those suddenly being recognised as fitting well into the defence world. I think it's always been true that as technologies evolve and become available, human beings have had a great propensity to finding ways to use them to kill each other. And this works, of course, both ways. I mean, particularly insurgent groups and terrorist groups have been very, very capable of picking up on new technologies and using those in very destructive ways. And those whose responsibility it is to defend us have to be able to counter those uses and also, in turn, find uses of technology to make them strong where otherwise they might have weaknesses. And one example of that would be the increasing use of uncrewed and autonomous systems. Now, where in Western democracies, highly trained manpower in the military is a really scarce resource. And so using those systems enables us to use the manpower that we have and multiply its effectiveness. Technologies like artificial intelligence have a lot to offer in defence. Unfortunately, used by the unscrupulous because they're widely available, they also have the propensity to potentially target non-combatants in a really unwelcome sort of way. But using artificial intelligence carefully and well can also enable us to increase the effectiveness of a relatively small number of highly trained people and bring us new ways of finding very precise mechanisms to identify and to target hostile forces. That's one good example of the way that technology is evolving in defence.
Yeah, and how advanced? I mean, we've all probably read and watched, frankly, quite terrifying content in terms of the potential for those technologies to be used by bad actors in ways which are very destructive to humanity. But how advanced is the use of those AI-driven autonomous weapon systems and autonomous systems at this point in time? Are we still in the development phase, or have we moved far beyond that and we're actually, they're in the real world already? It's just a question of how effectively they can be regulated and how effectively safety protocols can be put around them to protect us.
Well, autonomous weapon systems, in a sense, have been around really for a long time. I mean, when the pilot of a combat aircraft fires a heat-seeking missile, he doesn't have any control over it. It's autonomous in the sense that it has to seek its target, and its software will take it there. So it's not an entirely new development in that sense. And artificial intelligence is indeed already being used in the defence world. I can pick an example from our own technology. We use AI techniques in systems that are designed to track and target drones in complex environments. For example, when they go behind partial obstructions like trees, walls and so on, to be able to predict where they're going to come up and to be able to track them. And similarly, to be able to identify different types of drones and to discriminate between drones and birds and other small flying objects. That uses artificial intelligence, which is a very effective way of doing so compared to a man who would have to sit there 24 hours staring at it, potentially getting rather tired, having to stop for lunch breaks and so on. So yes, it's already in use. I think moving from where we are onto more ambitious uses, well, there are some limitations to that, which I won't go into in great detail. But it's perhaps, I mean, anyone using ChatGPT and being impressed by what a fantastic conjuring trick it is, shouldn't perhaps be taken too far down the line of using generative AI for defence purposes. I think that perhaps has some way to go.
Yeah, and forgive me there, Andy, for some somewhat sloppy use of terminology there. I suppose I had in my mind the use of AI not just to identify threats, but also as an offensive, as an offensive weapon. I mean, I remember listening to this, as I say, frankly terrifying lecture where they described a world in which characteristics of certain populations could be described to an AI-driven weapon system so that those individuals could be targeted en masse, for example. So I suppose that was where I was coming from in terms of whether or not, or how indeed, those dangers can be carefully contained, or governments can attempt to contain them.
Yes, it's an interesting idea, and I think I've come across similar ideas. One point is that there isn't much that can be done by AI that couldn't be done by people with equally evil intent. So it's not a unique problem in that sense. Of course,
it's a scale, I suppose, at which it can be done, isn't it?
And it will require careful thought as to what the limits of the use of this kind of technology are. AI is certainly not the only technology that could have those kind of effects. I mean, there are certainly biological and genetic techniques that are being developed that could have really quite terrifying effects. So regulating those, ensuring that we do, if we're going to use them, do so in a responsible way is important, but also being aware that others may not do so, that others may use them in an irresponsible and very dangerous way, and being able to protect against that is equally important. Fundamentally, though, at the end of the day, it is people that create and use weapons, and not the weapons themselves, and not the technology itself that is the evil that we need to guard against here. And we should also be careful about bringing in, perhaps too early and without sufficient careful thought, restrictions that might prevent us developing things that could defend against that kind of threat.
Absolutely, and of course there are substantial benefits as well. I mean, as you've outlined, you can derive much greater efficiency and cost savings, if you like, from your existing estate, but also in terms of your forward-looking technological development. If you can automate potentially dangerous roles, there can be a real saving, to human safety in that sense. Enhanced performance of existing systems that you've described. So we mustn't lose sight of the benefits of it while we're trying to protect ourselves against the threats.
No, that's absolutely right. And of course, when we're talking about cost savings here, we're not just talking about someone in the Treasury thinking, oh, thanks, that's great. What it means is that for a given budget, you can have much, much greater effect, a much greater deterrent and defensive effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, we've covered some really wide-ranging subjects there. I'd like to just delve for a moment, if I may, before we finish, into your own personal background. I think that's always a really interesting journey to go on with entrepreneurs that I speak to. I think for you in particular, you obviously work in a company in an industry that clearly has the power to shape the world around you, and obviously for that reason has the potential to be very rewarding, but it can also surely be a world with tremendously high pressure and stress. So it'd be great to understand a little bit about how you shutter that in your personal life, how you manage to get away from it to remain, on an even keel, if you like.
Well, jobs in this sector can be stressful. But jobs in the business world generally can be stressful, and they're not just stressful for me. They affect my colleagues just as much as well. And I think it's important to set the right tone, to be able to focus on the next thing and objectives, rather than dwelling unhelpfully on potential negative consequences is a good antidote to stress. And I think having a little bit of humour and a little bit of enjoyment in work is another important antidote to stress. And I think hard work in itself is actually a pretty good antidote to stress. But I've got no panacea for those things. being able, having a stable family life, I think is a very important counter to a stressful job, and I'm lucky enough to have that as well.
Wise words indeed. So I have one final question for you today, Andy, which is, what would you say if I gave you the opportunity to exchange places with any other person in any other career just for a day? Who would that be and why? What fascinates you? Where do you perhaps wonder what life is like on the other side?
My father was a great enthusiast for music. In fact, he was a great musician himself, and I love music myself. But I think I would have to admit that I don't have the creative spark. I mean, I would love to be somebody who could write a symphony and capture all of the complexity and detail of that symphony and hone it to perfection. I think if I was to have a musical career, it's more likely I'd be conducting an orchestra rather than be the peak of creative skill. But that would be lovely to me. I'd love to have a career in the creative sector.
That's fascinating. We've had so many really interesting responses to that question. We've definitely not had that one before. So thanks so much for that. And thank you very much for joining me today. They were really fascinating insights into the intricate workings of the defence industry, and in such an uncertain period for the globe, what's required to step up to the challenge of keeping us all safe. So thank you very much, Andy. And for our listeners, please do like, repost and subscribe via Spotify, Apple or your usual podcast provider. And as always, please remember that nothing in this podcast should be construed as investment advice or a solicitation to purchase securities in any company or investment product mentioned. See you all next time.